class. I also changed these definitions to racist and anti-racist ideas. I've leaned into describing ideas and policies and not identifying who individuals are in a permanent sense. I try to describe what individuals are being. Now I usually talk about an individual being racist or being anti-racist based on what a person is doing or not doing, saying or not saying in any given moment. Are they reinforcing or challenging the structure of racism? Are they building a new structure of anti-racism? My parents and not see each other since the Griffin is proposed. So generations of the concept that they are comic Broadway Presbyterian Church involved that turned into a movie source. New York Times, old friends back in something new. After the chords of soul liberation fell silent, my parents finally spoke again, and a spark finally lit. 2 days later, Dad called. He asked Mom if they called to the mission field in Palestine, leaving in March. Mom and Dad persevered, even after Mom left to teach in a rural Liberian village outside Monrovia for 9 months. 8 years later, they were married, daring to name me their second son, exalted father. When I arrived in a world not in the practice of exalting black sons. Arrival, as my pregnant mother celebrated her 31st birthday on June 24th, 1982, President Reagan declared war on her unborn baby. We can put drug abuse on the run through stronger law enforcement, Reagan said in the Rose Garden. It wasn't drug abuse that was put on the run, of course, but people like me, born into this regime of stronger law enforcement. The stiffer sentencing policies for illegal drug activity, not a net increase in harm, caused the American prison population to quadruple between 1980 and 2000. While people convicted of violence typically account for about half of the prison population at any given time, more people were incarcerated for drugs than violence every year from 1993 to 2009. White Americans are more likely than Black and Latinx Americans to sell drugs, and these groups consume drugs at similar rates. Yet Black Americans are far more likely than white Americans to be jailed for drug offenses. Black Americans convicted of nonviolent drug-related activities remain in prison for about the same length of time, 58.7 months, as white Americans convicted of violence, 61.7 months. In 2018, Black and Latinx Americans were still grossly overrepresented in the prison population at 56%, double their percentage of the U.S. adult population. White Americans were still grossly underrepresented in the prison population at 30%, about half their percentage of the U.S. adult population. Reagan didn't start this so-called war, as historian Elizabeth Hinton recounts. President Lyndon B. Johnson first put us on the run when he named 1965 the year when this country began a thorough, intelligent, and effective war against crime. My parents were in high school when Johnson's war on crime mocked his under-supported war on poverty, like a heavily armed shooter mocking the under-resourced trauma surgeon. President Richard Nixon announced his war on drugs in 1971 to devastate his harshest critics, Black and anti-war activists. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, told a Harper's reporter years later, "Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Black Americans joined in the vilification, convinced that homicidal drug dealers, gun toters, and thieving heroin addicts were flushing down the drain all the hard-won gains of the civil rights movement To quote an editorial in the Washington Afro-American in 1981, some, if not most, Black leaders, in an effort to appear as saviors of the people against this menace, turned around and set the Black criminal alongside the white racist as the enemies of the people. Seemingly contradictory calls to lock up and to save Black people dueled in legislatures around the country, but also in the minds of Americans. Black leaders joined with Republicans from Nixon to Reagan and with Democrats from Johnson to Bill Clinton in calling for and largely receiving more police officers, tougher and mandatory sentencing, and more jails. But they also called for the end of police brutality, more jobs, better schools, and drug treatment programs. These calls were less enthusiastically received. By the time I came along, in 1982, the shame about Black-on-Black crime was on the verge of overwhelming a generation's pride about Black is beautiful. Many non-Black Americans look down on Black Americans struggling with an addiction and revulsion, but too many Black folk look down on the same people in shame. Both of my parents emerged from impoverished families, one from northern urban projects, one from southern rural fields. Both framed their rise from poverty into the middle class in the 1980s as a climb up the ladder of education and hard work. As they climbed, they were inundated with racist talking points about Black people refusing to climb, the ones who were irresponsibly strung out on heroin and crack, who enjoyed stealing and being criminally dependent on the hard-earned money of climbing Americans like them. In 1985, adored civil rights lawyer Eleanor Holmes Norton took to the New York Times to claim the remedy is not as simple as providing necessities and opportunities, as anti-racist activists argued. She urged the overthrow of the complicated, predatory ghetto subculture. She called on people, like my parents with ghetto origins, to save ghetto males and women by impressing on them the values of hard work, education, respect for family, and achieving a better life for one's children. Norton provided no empirical evidence to substantiate her position that certain ghetto Black people were deficient in any of these values. But my parents, along with many others in the new Black middle class, consumed these ideas. The class that challenged racist policies from the 1950s through the 1970s now began challenging other Black people in the 1980s and 1990s. Anti-racism seemed like an indulgence in the face of the self-destructive behavior they were witnessing all around them. My parents followed Norton's directive. They fed me the mantra that education and hard work would uplift me, just as it had uplifted them, and would, in the end,